Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sophie Yano, and I am the incoming editor-in-chief for the Journal on Dispute Resolution here at Moritz. I'm honored today to welcome a faculty member who's incredibly special to this community, and he'll be introducing our keynote speaker. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dean Alan Michaels. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. And good afternoon, everyone. I am Alan Michaels, and it's my special pleasure to introduce my extraordinary friend and colleague, former colleague, Professor John Powell. Presently, the founding executive director of the University of California, Berkeley's Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, and the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion. John occupies a unique position in the legal academy when it comes to civil rights and racial and social justice. A little background. After founding the University of Minnesota's Institute on Race and Poverty in 1993, John joined our faculty here at the College of Law in 2003, where he served Ohio State for nearly a decade as the inaugural director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, and as Moritz's inaugural Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. John's varied, impressive background and CV, his book-length CV, has only one line expressly mentioning alternative dispute resolution matters. He was a mediation trainer in the Conciliation Forum of Oakland from 1985 to 1987. In fact, however, we could not be graced with a more appropriate keynote speaker for this ADR symposium, Rethinking Systems Design for Racial Justice. To begin with, racial justice and system design has been the focus of his entire career. Every one of us who knows John has had our own thinking about the meaning of race and the sources of racial injustice, shaped by John's insight and instruction on these issues, and the oft-hidden but overwhelming role that systems and structures play. So it's no exaggeration to call system design and racial justice a core part of his life's work. Even further, though, John is rare in his ability to lead in two very distinct spheres. In his academic work and speeches, John pulls no punches in describing racial injustice, nor especially in the solutions he advocates. He's all in for change, and often radical change. And yet, John is simultaneously a go-to leader for communities and organizations that, although far from radical, have awakened, whether through litigation or enlightenment, to the need for racial justice and seeking help along that pathway. I think it's both a core ADR mentality at the heart of John's character and a genius about structures and system design that allow him to be both the pull no punches John and the yes, I can help you John at the same time. Thus, Moritz's preeminent program on dispute resolution and its focus on dispute systems design are the perfect backdrop for John's work and the framing of this symposium. John's paper, which I understand will be dropped into the Zoom chat in seconds, titled Form, Substance, Understanding Conceptual and Design Difference Among Racial Equity Proposals and Bold Application, takes stock of the shape and form of various race equity proposals and proposes one design for advancing racial equity. Travel delays prevented this from being an in-person welcome back to John, but please join me in a virtual warm welcome to our keynote speaker, John Powell.
Thank you, Alan. It's very good to see you. I wish I was there in person. Just by way of information, my plane was delayed and the connecting flight wouldn't get me there to actually present to you. So just a few comments before I start. I wrote this paper with Ned Connor. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then Ned's going to talk for another 10 minutes or so, and then we will open it up to questions and answers or comments. Again, it's a pleasure to be with you virtually. It'd be much greater pleasure to be there in person. I hope we can correct that sometime soon.
Well, Professor Powell, while we try to get him online.
Equity is a word that's now used a lot. It's obviously part of this symposium. It's the way we think about justice. We think about achieving it through equity. And it's part of President Biden's administration. Something like 75% of corporate 500 companies have equity somewhere in their mission statements or goal statements. So it's actually become quite prominent. And yet there's a lot of conflict. There's some of the conflict I think is sincere. Some of it I think is political, but there are people who are pushing back against equity. And those who are pushing back against equity are pushing in favor of what they call equality. So one of the things I want to do is sort of situate equity and equality, and then suggest that we actually need to reach beyond both to what I call target universalism. And then Ned will talk about a system that can help us do this. So one of the things that's implicit in the concept of equity is and equality is right power relationships. So it's a relational concept. Right now, equality is so prominent in our discourse that it's hard to remember that it's a relatively new concept in terms of political organization. If you go back to the American independence and the French Revolution, those were the two first countries that began to organize meaningfully around the idea of equality. Clearly, the terms were around before then, but the meaning and application was not. To some extent, my paper, our paper, I should say, is a conversation between Aristotle, Jefferson, and Lincoln, and the symposium. And so it's a conversation that's quite important that literally spans centuries and even millennia. So we actually at least introduce in a serious way to the concept of equality in the Declaration of Independence by Jefferson. I hold these truths be self-evident that all men are created equal. Now, some people said Jefferson clearly did not mean equality in the way that we talk about it now, that he wasn't talking about individuals, and that debate goes back and forth. But in a sense, it doesn't matter because Lincoln did clarify in the Stephen Douglas debate that equality, in fact, is individual. And if there's any ambiguity in the Declaration of Independence, he clarified it, and I think he now represents how we think about equality. So how does Aristotle fit into this? Well, our concept of equality really comes from Aristotle. And Aristotle had two different versions of equality. He talked about equality, which equality and fairness requires that when people are situated the same, they're treated the same. Very succinct statement, but there's a second part to this statement, and that is Aristotle also said, when people are situated differently, equality and fairness requires that they be treated differently. So the first part he called arithmetic equality, the second part geometric equality. What's come to being practiced largely in our courts and in much of our discourse is the first part of Aristotle's insight. That is, that everybody should be treated the same. And that was a big improvement over previous laws and previous practices, which basically said some people were not of value or of less value, and therefore they should be treated differently. And this was explicit, not just in ancient times, but implicit in the United States as well. We all know the Dred Scott case. We know our history, or some of our history of slavery, the Hambura laws. So this was fairly well accepted in terms of the organization of society, that the people themselves were different and they should therefore be treated differently. So equality, saying that when people are situated the same, they should be treated the same. And going back to Aristotle, when people are situated differently, they should be treated differently, is actually a profound and radical concept that's still being debated. And so within our courts and law, courts have struggled with this concept. So we have the 14th Amendment, equal protections was sometimes referred to as the Equal Protection Clause, could also be called the Citizenship Clause. But the notion that people should be treated equally by the state. What the Constitution does not do is define what equality is. It doesn't situate us in this debate or the conversation between Aristotle, Jefferson, and Lincoln. And I think it's important that we began to situate ourselves. So what's called formal equality presuppose, in some respects, that our situatedness is irrelevant. So I'm going to treat everybody the same. Now, intuitively, when you think about that, there's an intuitive appeal, but also there's something that clearly doesn't make sense. So so if we think about pregnancy, we think about someone with what's called a disability. If we think about unequal wealth, and I had in my slides, which I'm obviously not showing you, a person in a wheelchair at the bottom of an escalator. So the escalator doesn't serve the person in a wheelchair in the same way it serves someone who's ambulatory. And so they're saying that our situatedness matters. And I have another slide where I show three people. On one part of the slide, there are three people who are of a different height, and they're trying to look over a fence and suggest that we need to do something to make sure they all can look over the fence. One's shorter, one's taller. But it directs our attention to the people themselves. So there's a second version of that slide, which are three people are the same height, but they're one standing on a mound, one standing in a ditch, and one standing on a flat surface. That directs our attention to the difference in the structures themselves. And so in our society, and there's a guy who wrote a book called Tilley. He basically said we're methodologically individualists. That is, that we look at things through an individualist frame. And so we are not necessarily race blind, but we're structurally blind. So we don't see the work, or it's hard for us to see the work the structures are doing. And so that pulls us into a kind of formal equality where we say, let's treat everybody the same. Although when we examine it a little bit more, we say, well, that really doesn't make any sense. And so equity was an attempt to correct that. Equity, in a sense, was reaching back to Aristotle to say that, people are in fact situated differently, and they should therefore be treated differently. The hard part of the work related to equity then is acknowledging that difference. So this paper goes beyond equity, though. It says that the way we understand equity and the way we approach equity in our society is incredibly complicated and conflictual. And that so sometimes we use equity to sort of think about differences in people. And sometimes we use it as a process. Sometimes we use it as a goal. And each one of these differences create a different orientation. So in practice, not necessarily conceptually, but in practice, equity is largely seen as closing disparity between favored and less favored groups. And that approach, the disparity approach, has a lot of problems associated with it. In a sense, you could think about Justice Powell and Bakke, when Powell rejected the notion that they're discrete and insular minorities. And he said that we're a country of minorities and that there was no way for the court to sort of decide which group was more deserving. I think there's some challenge to Powell's formulation, but that became, in a sense, the law of the land, and since been adopted by more conservative members of the Supreme Court. But the notion that that our situatedness is irrelevant then pushes us back to a kind of formality that we can't recognize. So it's interesting that we've actually moved away from that, if not legally, at least in terms of our public discourse and our public policy. But in moving away from it, we again move back to one group has more, are situated in such that they're getting more benefits, more consideration from society. Another group has less. That's obviously sometimes expressed very sharply in racial terms, suggesting that whites have more and people of color, particularly African Americans and Latinos, Native Americans have less. And therefore, equity requires that we close this gap. And in closing this disparity, the assumption is that we have to take from the favored group and give to the less favored group. And so it oftentimes is practiced as a binary in terms of a zero sum, that one group has to give up something in order so that the other group can get something. And in picking the group that gets something, it's oftentimes a single group. So it's not distributed across a number of groups. It's usually the most marginal group versus the favorite group. If you think about that a little bit, it becomes clear very quickly that that creates tension. So anytime you have what's seen as scarce resources in society, and you're having groups compete for them, it creates polarization and what we call breaking. And so some people would say, given our history, given where we are, basically that's too bad. That's what we have to do. Even if that was right conceptually, and I'll come back to that because I don't think it's right conceptually, it's not sustainable politically. And so when you're picking a marginalized group, by definition that they're marginal in some respects, and you say you have to take from a more favored group, and sometimes the majority group oftentimes is feeling resentful, they're feeling that they're not being heard, they're not being seen, and so you have this competition. I think you can make a case for specific benefits going to a group, but that case largely is not made. That case is largely assumed in our practice of equity. And so some people argue for, instead of targeting a specific group, can we have universal goals? That is, can we say we're going to do something for everybody? And so in a sense, we're moving into targeted universalism. So targeted is where you pick a particular group and you focus on that group. Universal is where you're saying everybody is going to get something. There are benefits and liabilities with each approach by itself. So when you target groups, I've already talked about creating resentment, creating a backlash, it being hard to justify. When you're saying, let's just focus on everybody, you're ignoring people's situatedness, you're ignoring that some groups may need more, and a universal approach may in fact exacerbate disparities. So even though I've talked a little bit about the problem with disparities do play an important role in terms of a well-ordered society, understanding that first in terms of diagnostic, Secondly, it actually shows us if something is working or how it's working. And again, at time, the courts themselves have been open to the notion that disparities are suggestive of possible problems with systems and discrimination. Hasn't been consistent on that, but at least at times it actually points us in that direction. So if that's a problem, and there are many other that we touch on in the paper, I won't go through them all here, but if that's a problem, what's the solution? And what we suggest in the paper is targeted universalism in service of belonging. So what is targeted universalism? Sounds like a wonky phrase. And basically it says Aristotle was right, or he has a more right than what a formal sense of equality, and that we have to hold on to both parts of Aristotle's insight, not just the part that says when people are situated the same, we treat them the same. So targeted universalism says our goal, and this is the term, our goal is not simply just to eliminate disparities, because if that's the goal, that means that the baseline for that goal becomes the favorite group. We're saying that all the other groups should have what that favorite group has, or that the most marginal group should have what that favorite group has. Implicit in this also that the favorite group, whatever they have it somewhat illegitimately. It's not saying that's never correct, but it's very problematic in terms of public discourse. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to say every group should have something, and that something is not tied to any particular group. So for an example would be, say, everyone should be free of COVID or have protection from COVID. It's not saying that one group should have more protection or one group should have less protection. It's saying everyone, that can be seen as a universal. Now, how do you actually arrive at those universals? There's some that seem intuitively clear. Virtually all of us want our children to be healthy and safe. All of us need and want adequate food, adequate housing. So there's some things that seem to be intuitively clear that should be universal. For those things that's less clear, the way you develop those universals is through a process called co-creation. That is, the groups themselves come to some agreement about what those universals are. So that's the universal. The universal is the goal, not the strategy. It's not a universal strategy. You're not giving everyone the same thing. You're saying everyone needs to get to point X. Then you look at where people are in relationship to point X. And you look at both culture, structures, stories, and see how groups are distributed in terms of getting to point X. And what you will find is that there's a very uneven distribution. But then you adopt strategies targeted to each group to get them to that universal. You're not picking one group over another group. You're saying every group, we want to get every group to that universal. And in doing that, you actually take away most of the hostility between groups. You're saying all groups count, but you're also saying we acknowledge that groups are situated differently. So the situatedness does the work in some respect that we normally assign to things like race or gender or other marginalized groups. We take the condition of their marginality, if you will, and make that the thing that guides us. So that's called targeted universalism. And it requires both the universal goal and the targeted strategy. And targeted universalism is both a programmatic approach, but it's also a communication approach. It tells us how to talk about these things. It tells us how to frame it in such a way that everyone can feel like they count and everyone can feel like they're deserving. And we have done versions of this all around the country, and it creates much more cohesion between groups and much more and much better outcomes. It doesn't do everything, but no platform does everything. But it definitely moves us in a different direction. Now, Target Universalism is outcome oriented. And it builds on a lot of stuff that's already in our practice and in law. But it clarifies it in a way that equity, well, we would argue, actually undermines a lot of social cohesion. So if you sort of really thinking about what we're saying, one of the tricky things is how do you decide what part of the situatedness is relevant and how to address it? That becomes a process. You have to make some decisions around that. But at least it moves us back to a situation of both inclusion, participation, and fairness. Part of what this approach requires or entails is the acknowledgement that structures and systems matter, and they're not neutral. They're normalized against certain populations. So let me give you a couple examples, and then I'll start wrapping up. Think about an airline. I was thinking about an airline a lot yesterday. Their overhead luggage racks on an airline, and it creates a situation where people who are shorter have a disadvantage. Now, what group is shorter in our country? Well, as a group, women tend to be shorter. And as a group, women have less upper body strength. And as a group, and this last thing may be somewhat controversial, but I think is empirically accurate nonetheless, women tend to carry more luggage. So women try to address this problem oftentimes by making individual interventions. And so women disproportionately check their luggage, and not simply because they like to, but because it avoids the problem. But now look at this. In order to check your luggage at an airline, you need to get there 45 to an hour earlier, 45 minutes to an hour earlier. And when you leave, you have to wait anywhere from a half an hour to an hour. And much too often, the luggage is lost. What that really points to is that individual solutions are not adequate to address these structural problems. And so we need to actually pay attention to the structures themselves and the work they're doing. Now notice, in that story I just shared with you, in that example, there was no mention of, was the airline designed to disadvantage women? We have a concept of disparate impact in law. And so the effect of something can be one yardstick for saying whether something not only is fair, equal, but also the kind of intervention we might make. So going back again, Target Universalism addresses the notion of the different group situatedness. It addresses much of the acronym and hostility between groups. And it has something, in essence, for everyone. It's a different story, it's a different approach. And so we sometimes refer to this as equity 2.0. So equity in its narrow sense creates breaking or competition. Target Universalism, with some interesting tweaks to equity, can create coherence and what we call bridging. And what we're trying to get to is a place where there no one group, no one part of society has power and domination over the other. And the frame of Target Universalism helps us a lot in that. And target universalism and bridging itself supports the notion that everyone belongs, but everyone, and that no one is other. In other presentations, I oftentimes say that the problem of the 21st, 22nd century is othering. So that the solution to othering, though, is not saming, it's actually belonging. And belonging is predicated on a few things. One, we co-create the thing we belong to. In that sense, is different than inclusion. You have a voice, you have some power to participate in the very thing that you're joining. I'll close by giving an example of a party that I'm actually planning a party. I have a birthday coming up. Hopefully some of you will join. But here's the rub. My party, one could argue, is an inclusion party, not a belonging party, in the sense that I probably won't consult you on the music. I won't consult you on the food or the invite list. Maybe I will. But I'll invite you. I'll invite you as a guest. And as a guest, I hope you enjoy yourself, but it's not your party. That's inclusion. Belonging is predicated on the notion that we are going to give a party. And so we are going to decide the food, the music, the guest list. And so we will collectively make decisions. That's belonging. And in transition, I'm going to turn over to my co-author, Ned Connor, who has what may seem as a fairly radical approach to how should we go about making decisions. But one thing is clear, we shouldn't make decisions so some groups have power over others, whether it's racial, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's gender. So belonging is useful in terms of understanding race, but it's also useful in understanding how other groups, in addition to racialized groups, may be silenced or not having the input and power and participation that's necessary to really belong. So Ned, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
This idea of targeted universalism, I appreciate you so much for raising it in this context and identifying the distinctions between equality, equity, and targeted universalism. And I wonder, given the one line on your CV as an Oakland community mediator, for the mediators out there, for the students here at the law school who are mediating cases or facilitators out there, many of us are thinking about equity and equality as mediators, but I would be willing to venture that most in this conversation are considering targeted universalism for the first time here this afternoon, or when they read a draft or your abstract. So I wonder, do you have any advice for the mediator or facilitator about how to implement, or if we should implement, targeted universalism? And I'll try to work with Ned to get online.
Yes, so thanks for the question, Bill, and thanks for having this symposium. I think it's real. I see Ned.
Yeah, all right.
So Ned, just basically, you can imagine, so this is actually looking at structures, looking at people, it's looking at how they're situated. But there's been a lot of problems. Equality is important. Equality is relative. It's so there's even experiments showing that among monkeys, they care about equality in the sense that they care about the disparities. So disparities matter. So, but oftentimes it can be two people or two groups, neither of which have enough. And so if it's just thinking about closing the gap between people, and certainly if you're thinking about taking from one person to give to another person, you've already set up a situation where there's going to be polarization, where there's likely to be resentment. And so I would say the mediation process, and I haven't mediated in a long time, but I would say three things it should do. One, it should actually invite people to sort of think about that universal role, not just the gap between them. What do they all need? What does everyone need? And then what's the process of getting there? But also, and this has been done a lot in mediation, I read some of the other papers, what about the power differentiation between groups? So if the power is too great in terms of distorting, the mediator is there in part to sort of help address that, but it distorts the outcome. So the process is problematic if the power differential is too great. And the power differential can show up in 1,000 different ways. What language are you talking? Where is it? Can you get to it? How can someone wait a long time? I have enough resources that I can wait a year, or I have to make a decision today. So I think in terms of not just interpersonal, but in terms of the structures, in terms of how we frame this, that TU has a lot to suggest, even in the context of mediation. And I'll come back to that later, but I want to give you a chance to hear from Nat.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I'll take that as a yes. All right. Oh boy. Okay. I didn't know I was going to be talking. The things that we've just been talking about require that power to make decisions be distributed pretty much equally, as John has said. And voting doesn't do that. Whether it's voting for representatives or whether it's voting on measures directly. And that's the way we do democracy, is through voting. Now that we have our new technologies, there are new possibilities for how we might do democracy. And in the paper, which probably no one's read because I don't think it's been available, there is a new kind of decision system that uses these new technologies that equally distributes across an entire population the power to propose. And at the same time, it does not give to anyone in the population the power to decide, which is to say, to unilaterally make the decision. Both of those conditions, it's a new way to do democracy. And it's never been tried before because it never could be tried. So it needs to be tested harmlessly. And that's what the paper presents, is the idea that we tested in the laboratory. Okay. This is where I would really like to have questions.
The first question that's in the chat function is, in pursuit of this idea of co-creation that you raised, Professor Powell, what role does power negotiation play in facilitating community conversations?
And so a couple of things. If you think about most contracts now, like AT&T or whatever, they have many of them have provisions in the contract saying if there's dispute, it will be arbitration or mediation, and not the court. And there's been a lot of writing on that, suggesting that that option is a power distortion, right? Even saying we will mediate, even saying we will go to arbitration. I didn't say that. No one asked me about the rules of how we deal with disagreements. So the rules themselves, the setting, is a reflection of power. And of course, most of us never read that. We just sign the contract, and it's what was close to what's called the Heaton contract. I sign it, or I don't get the service. I don't really get to negotiate the conditions for the conversation, even having conversation. I may not want a conversation. Can I opt out? Well, you can opt out, but you have to give up your phone, you have to give up the internet, you have to give up your credit card. Um, so, um, uh, so I think even the environment, the conditions, the rules in which we mediate, the time frame, all of those are decisions that have to be made. They're made largely from a power source to someone or some group that has very little power.
Thank you for that, Professor Powell. Another question from Zoom is, let's assume our universal goal is to allow access to the highest quality of education. How do we make this policy without creating a zero-sum game?
So if I understand the question, and Ned, I want to invite you into this as well. So the universal goals are, so if you say, can you go to OSU? OSU is a goal. It's a wonderful university. I'm glad to have spent 10 years there myself. But it's really in pursuit of something else. Of, as you said, a high quality education, access to a bunch of things. Everyone should have access to a high quality education. Now, obviously, this becomes harder in the context of we have scarce resources. Two quick thoughts. One, those scarce resources are not completely resolved in the context of TU, but they're certainly not resolved in the context of equity. So it's not like TU can answer all the questions, but I would say it answers more questions. It responds to more situation than equity does. And because equity in that situation, and I don't want to be unfair in my characterization of equity, is saying it's just competition between groups, right? It's, as opposed to saying we all should have a quality education. In this narrow sense, if you just focus on disparities and you say all of us equally have a bad education, but no one has a good education, so it's fair. That's not really what we want. There was a study in Dayton, Ohio, some years ago of closing disparity between whites and blacks on a number of indicators, including health. And after 10 years, they found that they had essentially closed those disparities. And not because blacks were doing better, but because whites were doing worse. And then people say, well, that's not really what we're after. What were you after? Really say it. The obvious thing in terms of education is that it requires us to restructure how we do education. I live in California now. California, 40 million people, until recently population explosion. And what we did, and then during those 20 years of population explosion, we built something like 10 new prisons and 1 new university. And so we had the elasticity and the vision and the power to expand our prisons, but we didn't expand our universities. Just as a footnote, now one of my own things, I want some students to sue California or sue Ohio or sue Michigan, not because I'm a lawyer, but to say, not that a black student didn't get in or a white student didn't get in, it's saying students didn't get in because the universities didn't provide enough seats, period. The state has created artificial scarcity by refusing to build more universities. But if someone who commits a crime, they don't say, I committed a crime, but I can't get in because there's no room. It's a scarce, a room in a prison is scarce, and so they had to keep me out. We just said build more prisons. So part of the elasticity issue is resolved because if everyone feel like they have a stake in the game, people are more likely to support it. Again, you still have problems of distribution and scarcity, but it takes us a long way from just looking at disparities. Ned, do you want to comment on that?
One thing that you said was that we need to do education differently, and that possibility is now with us. We can have tutoring online on call. That possibility exists now, where the frontline tutor is an AI that deals directly with any student that wants it at any time. And then the backup is a human, which can be called on by the student whenever the AI is insufficient. that kind of system could be made very high quality indefinitely. The improvement, there's no limit to the degree to which it could be improved. And it would actually give equal educational opportunities to everyone at any time in the entire population. So it is possible, once we work out the details, to do education differently in a way that would allow full equality.
Is one of the Chinese are considering providing educational training and skills to parents. This is different than homeschooling, where we just sort of say, you want to educate your child, go ahead. But you weren't trained, you don't have any real resources. And they're saying, can we actually train parents and then pay them? So we actually deal with employment and we deal with education in a very different way. So I think that what Ned said in terms of we have to have different models. If we say our goal is to make sure not only that it's equal, but it's also high quality, and we're not getting that right now. You need a different system.
Professor Powell, that's imagining systems design. We were discussing in the prior panel the distinction between imagining and reimagining.
Right.
Let's not start with the status quo. Let's start with these new ideas that you and Ned have, and that your ideas on technology, I'm sure, resonate for our prior panel. We just talked about technology and embedding some of the technology in police training. So I also just want to note, Professor Powell, suing the University of California is obviously in the news as Berkeley forced to lower its enrollment.
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy. It's crazy. And you know, it's actually worse than that, because they've been sued because they're saying they didn't meet the state EPA requirements, environmental impact requirements. And part of the requirements is that we don't have enough housing. Yes, I'm on a housing commission in California. We figure we're about almost 3 million units short. That's a whole state. So the university, not perfect, but it's a great place to be. They actually proposed building more housing. But then a different group actually sued them saying, no, we don't want any more housing. So saying you can't have more students because you don't have enough housing. And then when the school says, okay, we'll build more housing, they say, we don't want any more housing. So it's this catch-22, which suggests to me that something's really problematic about our system right now. That how we're making decisions, we're making bad decisions, and they're not inclusive. Anyway, so.
I appreciate that reaction. And I just want to note we have about 9 minutes left for the session. I have one more question that I want to ask you from the chat, and then we might have time for a second one, and I'd like to ask the two of you for your closing remarks. So the question comes from Michael, and he says, my question is, since both Aristotelian situated groups affect the living organism, both share. Would a third group, like Mother Earth, be the universal group we move towards, such as science, data sharing, peace efforts, valuing cultures, sustainable systems, etc.? Somehow could we be introduced to both ways of thinking?
Right.
I see a couple more questions in the chat, which I'll ask after your answer.
Well, I love the question, and there's now discussion about, sort of, it's a complicated question, but you think about the rights language and the critique on rights, because rights tend to be individualistic and not relational in how we think about them. Like I have a right to keep you off my land, then you have an obligation to stay off my land. And so people are talking about giving rights to nature. And there's an old book now called Do Trees Have Standing? And I think what they're trying to reach toward is that we are in a relationship with nature, not just there to exploit it, not just there to extract. And when we try to just exploit it and extract, it comes back and bites us. In California, again, we're dealing with wildfires every year now, and the wildfire season keeps getting extended. So I think yes to your question, that we have to figure out, we talk about the circle of human concern when no one's outside the circle, everyone belong. But we also make it clear that the circle is not just for humans, it's actually for other life expressions in the earth itself. How do we think about that in a different way? And the UN report on climate suggests we don't have a long time to think about this. We need some new systems quickly, just from a very practical perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Powell, for that. And I have two more questions that come in, and as we're at a law school, I feel obligated to ask them. Targeted universalism. We know there are challenges in the courts with respect to race and equity considerations. We know that ideas that focus on these are subject to litigation. So one participant asked about if you have ideas for potentially amending or proposing the language for a constitutional amendment, or so that we can take a targeted universalist approach, or is there a way to thread the needle on these legal matters so that policymakers, so that states, communities can implement ideas taking a targeted universalist approach?
Right. Well, Ned and I are both suggesting something that's pretty new. Targeted universalism has been around now, so it's been tried. It's out of the laboratories. And I would say you can actually do more under targeted universalism than you can do under equity. So Justice Kennedy in Parents Involved, he basically said you can look at all the different factors that create racialized marginality. But he said you can't look at the individual race of the students. You can look at neighborhoods, you can look at poverty rates, you can look at educational history in the family. He's actually given, and we've actually done that. We've taken what Kennedy said in Parents Involved and gone to school districts who were trying to integrate on a racial basis, and the court was saying you can't use race without strict scrutiny. And if you go back and look at Parents Involved, Kennedy says, when you look at these factors, you don't even trigger strict scrutiny. Because what we use, in a sense, race a proxy for situatedness. And what we're saying, let's use situatedness directly. And the court so far, and the court is changing, but the court so far has said, that's okay. That's okay. So I don't think we need much retrofitting to use targeted universalism. I think we can use it right now, both at the state level, in education and in planning, but also even at the federal level. Now that may change given the composition of the court.
So we have just a few minutes remaining, and I want to get both of your reactions for the audience in person and our virtual audience. We came here today, and you are gracious with your presence and your draft paper that you posted to think about, to rethink systems design for racial justice and equity. And as we move forward for the rest of the day, we're going to focus on people doing the work at Truth and Reconciliation and Race Equity Commissions. I know Amber Johnson is online. She's with Charleston's Race Equity Coalition. I know that Professor Rose Brewer just hopped online. She does work in Minnesota on Truth and Reconciliation Working Group. So perhaps you can, in just a minute or two, Ned and Professor Powell, give advice to those who are doing the work. What, taking through the lens of your paper, what would you suggest that they think about as they continue to take steps on this struggle to advance justice through an equity or a targeted universalism approach?
And Ned, do you want to go first?
No, you go first.
So one of the things that's supported in targeted universalism is moving toward belonging. And Truth and Reconciliation, I knew both Bishop Tutu and Alex Bahrain, who created Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. It's actually been quite powerful, and at the same time, it has some limitations because there actually is not a single truth. And we have to be careful. If we have a single truth or propose a single truth, it actually ends up alienating a lot of people who don't see things or experience things in that way. We have multiple truths, not just for each other, we have multiple truths for ourselves. And it's not saying, I'm not a relativist, I don't think everything goes, but we have to create space for people to tell their stories where everyone's story matters. And right now we tell stories in a categorical way where my story counts, yours don't count. We're trying to correct that in history. You know, I mean, the fight right now in schools is, can you teach critical race theory? Can you teach the Holocaust? Can you teach the genocide? And what people say is that, well, it makes some people feel bad. And I say, well, it's supposed to. I mean, the Holocaust wasn't a cartoon. It wasn't a comedy. What's happening in Ukraine is not something that feels good. But we have to have a space where everyone can tell their story. So, they call that empathetic engagement or empathetic listening. And so if we think of truth and reconciliation, and from that context, I think from my perspective, it leans into TU, targeted universalism, and it invites everybody in. But I'd be concerned if we slip back into one or two things: a single truth and or practical essentialism. Like, this is the Black experience, this is the white experience. Our experiences are constantly being redefined, and our experiences are profoundly interrelated. But having said that, I think Truth and Reconciliation did not everything, but it did a tremendous service in South Africa, and done well, it can do that in the United States. But I would, again, just not lean toward a single truth or an assumption that people are either essentially tied to their group or transcending their groups as individual. Both of those binaries to me are problematic. The idea that we're just members of our group or that we're complete individuals.
Thank you, Professor Powell. Ned, any last comment with respect to that?
No, and the reason is the work that my side of things is just not ready yet to come out of the lab. So I can't, at the point it is ready, it will, I think, change everything, but it's not ready yet. So I don't have any advice.
Let me just say one more thing. I also think it's important for people, while acknowledging the past and standing in the past, to really reach for a future where everyone belongs. And oftentimes we don't do that. Oftentimes we get stuck in, make America great again, make India great again. We get stuck in imaginary past, which distorts our ability to imagine a future.
Well, Professor Powell, Mr. Connor, thank you both for your time here today. This has been inspirational, I think, for many of us in the room and online. And thank you for setting up our next conversation that will start in about 5 or 6 minutes. If you all could join me in a round of applause. And